Good afternoon and welcome to the latest lecture of the World War II Discussion Forums Winter and Spring Series. I'm Greg McNiff, the founder and executive director of the group. Before I introduce this afternoon's speaker, I want to briefly cover the usual housekeeping items. First, our speaker has graciously agreed to take questions after his prepared remarks. You have two ways to ask a question. You can either use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will read out your question to our speaker, or you can use the raise hand feature and ask your question directly after I unmute your line. Regardless, please be respectful of our speaker and the audience when asking your question. We'll take about 15 or 20 minutes of questions and go to about 2 p.m. New York time. Second, donations are always appreciated. Please note there's a donate tab on the website. Third, we now have a social media channel. You can access that through the icon at the top of the website. As I mentioned at the start of this event, we will be recording this talk for that channel, and it's usually posted a few hours after the end of the event. Fourth and finally, you can send any feedback through the website at wwiidf.org. Now to this afternoon's speaker, Colonel Joseph T. Molyson is U.S. Air Force retired after having served 32 years in the United States Air Force as a career intelligence officer. He was a squadron and wing commander of intelligence during Desert Storm and Air Force Reserve Command Senior Crisis Action Team Director during operations responding to the September 11, 2001 attacks. He also served on the United States Air Force Doctrine Working Group. His last assignment was Assistant Deputy Commander for Operations Intelligence, Headquarters Air Force Reserve Command. He has trained with and supported the U.S. Army, Navy, and Marines at various times. He was a liaison officer with the Royal Air Force, the Luftwaffe, Danish Air Force, and Danish Navy. His first book was Six Forces Over the Atlantic, and he actually presented that to us. It was a great lecture, so I'm thrilled to have him back for his second book in the sequence, titled Air Battles Before D-Day, How Allied Airmen Crippled the Luftwaffe and German Army in France, which reveals how a year of strategic bombing and aerial warfare created the conditions necessary for D-Day success. Not surprisingly, the reviews have been great. I'll just read two. The National Maritime Historical Society notes that Colonel Molyson provides a lucid, readable account of the Allies' essential requisite for D-Day, air support superiority over Northwest Europe. Overall, Air Battles Before D-Day is an enjoyable and easy-to-read treatment of enduring subject handled with scholarly ease. While the Midwest Book Review writes, it's informatively enhanced for the reader's benefit with the inclusion of numerous maps, a 2-page introduction, 4 appendices, 24 pages of notes, an 18-page selected bibliography, and a 16-page index. Moreover, it is a seminal, deftly written, extraordinary history that is especially and unreservedly recommended for personnel, community, and universities on their World War II, for their World War II history collections and supplemental curriculum studies lists. I would agree with both reviews. It was a great read and fantastically well researched. With that, I will turn it over to Joseph.
Good evening. I'm glad to be here. I appreciate Greg hosting this and looking forward to going over a little bit about the book, and be very glad to take questions and comments after we go through the prepared slides. All the illustrations you're going to see today on the PowerPoint are from the book. And although it's always tempting to expand beyond what your topic is, especially with something like World War II with so many facets, but I'm going to try to stick to my my script here, at least in my prepared remarks. So first of all, and I presume everybody can see the slides here. Air Battles for D-Day, and essentially is the topic is how Allied airmen crippled the Luftwaffe and German army in France. And also notice it does not say how the Allied airmen won the Battle of France or won World War II, but simply how they helped win by crippling from the air the ability of the German army to maneuver and the German Air Force to defend the German army on the ground. Okay, so the book covers air operations from approximately 1940 to 1944. It's centered on the European theater of operations, which essentially is everything north of the Mediterranean except the Mediterranean, the Italy, north of the Alps. Don't really talk too much about the Mediterranean theater, other than how it contributed to the victory in the European theater. Many of the things that many of the techniques and procedures and intelligence developed that helped us to win the air war in the European theater were developed in the Mediterranean theater. And in the book, I identify 6 air missions and some relevant factors to accomplishing those missions. We have extensive primary and secondary sources. They're listed for you. I would suggest that if you get into a particular topic, that you look at the references and do a little research on your own. I do use maps extensively because I was an intelligence officer for 32 years, and I always taught the guys that work with me and I asked the generals I work for to always look at the map, because the map tells you 90% of the story. If you don't have a map available as you study a particular topic and orient yourself properly to geography, you're not going to really get the whole picture. And so again, this is how Allied airmen crippled, not destroyed, but crippled the Luftwaffe and the German army before D-Day, and the next books in the series will continue that narrative. So in the book, I identified 6 air missions. First was defense of the maritime routes. That was between the so-called Arsenal of Democracy, which was North America, and particularly the United States, but also Canada. Defense of Britain from Luftwaffe attack, and even from reconnaissance. The Luftwaffe reconnaissance forces, which were very active over Britain until late 1940, were essentially stymied in their ability to collect information, overhead imagery by aircraft after the Battle of Britain, and their ability continued to decline throughout the war. The third mission was to defeat the Kriegsmarine coastal forces. This is separate from the Kriegsmarine forces that were in the Atlantic. And fourth is a strategic attack on the German homeland. Then the fifth, development of troop and cargo transport fleets. And finally, and not the least of which, is the support of the land forces. So let's get into each of these a little bit. First of all, defense of the maritime routes. This was a shared responsibility amongst all the Atlantic allies. And the idea was, if you were going to fight a war in Europe, you had to get all the production and manpower that you sourced from North America across the Atlantic, and mainly by ship, because the level of technology of airplanes at the time. So that including defeating or containing the U-boat force that the Germans put into the Atlantic and Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. U-boats were sunk at the mouth of the Mississippi River, for example, maybe 75 miles from my parents' home. So U-boats were a very real factor, and of course garner most of the attention when it comes to studying the Battle of the Atlantic. But also was necessary to restrict Luftwaffe maritime aircraft. We were fortunate in that Luftwaffe did not really spend very much in the way of resources to support the Kriegsmarine, therefore denying them of an air component. They also, at every turn, attempted to prevent the Kriegsmarine from getting its own air component. And it had an air component, very small, and as the war progressed, was more and more robbed by the Luftwaffe to provide additional maritime units to the Luftwaffe. And finally, air power deterred Kriegsmarine surface forces by attacking coastal bases in France, eventually, and also threatening Norway, so that Hitler eventually withdrew all his heavy units, battleships and heavy cruisers and pocket battleships, the surviving ones at least, back into Norwegian and Baltic bases. Why was it necessary? Again, because most of the military materiel that were produced certainly after 1940 was being produced in the United States, because the British had to specialize in the things that they needed immediately. The United States, meanwhile, was building a huge air force and deploying a huge ground army into Britain, about 1.5 million troops and untold tons of materiel. Here's a factory, I think it's in California, and they're producing the plexiglass doses for the early model A-20 bomber. Also, we had to develop and maintain air lines of communication, because most of the multi-engine aircraft that went to Europe did not go by ship. They flew themselves over, sometimes with guys who had been in flight training just 3 months before were now flying the Atlantic. That had to be a bit of a pucker factor. At the beginning of the war, we had to worry not only about the Germans and France, we had to worry about a fairly hostile Spain, and also Vichy, France, because they controlled much of North Africa, and they had airfields at Casablanca and Dakar that eventually became Allied airfields, but at the time were Vichy French airfields and very much anti-Allied. And part of that development of this and defense of this was to develop a series of air bases across Africa, which you can see in your map there. Don't talk very much in history about these, but a lot of guys went into some very rugged terrain and rugged conditions and developed these air bases so that so bombers could be delivered into as far as Cairo, and from there, Cairo, they could be dispatched along the North Mediterranean coast, and also east into the Middle East and on to India to fight the Japanese. Up in the north was a shorter route. The Brits nicknamed it the Arnold Line after General Hap Arnold, who was our commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces. The only trouble with that route was it was weather. Weather was always a factor in Europe, especially over the North Atlantic, and terrible during the winter months. And so that southern route, which incidentally was developed mainly by Pan American Airlines, became very vital, especially in 1942, after the United States and Britain invaded northwestern North Africa. That route became very, very essential. Another thing that of particular interest I bring up in the book is the maritime forces that were available to the Luftwaffe. The German Navy tried to get these ex-airliners, Focke-Wulf 200 airliners, into the Navy to do convoy search for their U-boat fleets, and so therefore the Allies countered by developing air bases in the northern UK and also in Iceland. These were not directly involved with the so-called Battle of Britain, but they were certainly vital to keep these German reconnaissance planes from assisting the U-boats. And of course, as the U-boats were pushed further west by the anti-submarine forces, they went out of the range even of these long-range aircraft. If you want to know more about all of that, you can read the first book, which is Six Air Forces Over the Atlantic. I go into all these things in excruciating detail, and it gives you a real good picture, I think, of what went on over the Atlantic. So the second major air mission was, again, mainly a British responsibility. The first was to deter a Kriegsmarine invasion, and they did that by maintaining air superiority over the British Isles, especially critical in southeastern Britain, southeastern England, because that was the shortest sea route from the continent into Britain. They also deterred the Kriegsmarine invasion by attacking the assemblage of various kinds of transport craft in the Channel harbors. This was the RAF Bomber Command back in 1940, 1941. Don't hear too much about them either in history, unfortunately. And they went in into harbors and destroyed a lot of craft that would have been used for a Operation Sea Lion, the proposed invasion of the British Isles, enough that it deterred Hitler and his admirals and his generals from actually attempting an invasion. And again, for defense of Britain restricting the Luftwaffe attacks against the cities, Luftwaffe reconnaissance to locate targets for the German Air Force. And then finally, we don't talk about this very much either. When our GIs showed up in Britain with P-38s and P-40s and B-17s, their radios and their procedures that they had learned in the United States did not work well in the British air defense system. And obviously, it's most disappointing to be shot down by Allied anti-aircraft battery because you can't talk to them on the radio. You can't talk to ground control. So big workload on the RAF was accepting all these air units that were being sent by the United States just as fast as we could build the aircraft and train the guys. And that was a major part of defense of Britain. An investment, if you will, logistical investment in future combat capability. This is a picture of a briefing room around 1943. And if you've seen these in war movies, that's exactly what they look like. As a matter of fact, my particular war was Operation Desert Storm in 1990, 1991. If you looked at our briefing room, wasn't a whole heck of a lot different. The computers really hadn't hit the squadron level yet, and we did a lot of paper maps and recognition models and posters and things like that. Not too much different. It's obviously different now that we're in a real computer age, but then it was pretty much the same thing as they had in the early 40s. As the war went on, another threat to the British Isles were missiles. The first missile threat was the V-1, which is a jet-powered, essentially a cruise missile. In fact, it was a cruise missile, just didn't use that term in those days. And this was jet-powered. It was not a rocket, and it was not a guided missile in that you aimed it in the general direction of your target, and you had a revolution counter on the nose. And when the revolution counter essentially measured mileage, and when it hit the correct mileage, it caused the elevators in the rear of the missile to cant the missile's nose down, and the missile fell down kind of almost vertically into a neighborhood or a factory or the countryside, wherever it happened to be at that particular moment. So defense against this was not that difficult. They weren't much faster than the fighter bombers the Germans had been using. They defended themselves with friendly fighters, the ones who were fast and armed with cannon, as well as many batteries of anti-aircraft guns and barrage balloons. So that was the Luftwaffe contribution. This enabled the Luftwaffe to continue their strategic air attack against Britain long after their bombers were no longer able to really penetrate British airspace. Another thing that realized is that the campaign to suppress these delayed the introduction or the initial attack until a week after D-Day. So these didn't directly affect D-Day, other than to divert some of the sorties that would have been flown against German defenses into bombing the launch sites that were being prepared by the Germans in coastal France. Another thing on the horizon that the Brits had to contend with for defending the UK was the V-2 missile, and the V-2 was a ballistic missile. It was essentially no terminal defense capability in those days. We've started to get that. Those of y'all that watch the news know that we now have some terminal defenses against ballistic missiles. Certainly not perfect, but in 1940s technology, the Brits did the only thing they could do. They found out where they were being built, and they just simply bombed the research and development facility. And again, they delayed the use of these until September 1944, several months after D-Day. The third mission was defeat of the Kriegsmarine coastal forces, mainly a British responsibility, because they had been doing this since right from the beginning of the war. Our guys who were going in were mainly training at the beginning for the strategic bombing mission. So it was mainly a British responsibility. The British developed specific aircraft and assigned specific units to the anti-coastal force mission, including some minesweeping capability, airborne mine detection, and laying a lot of mines in German, in French, and Belgian, and Dutch, and German coastal waters to kind of to interdict German coastal traffic. The Germans also had E-boats, which had a third of the firepower of a U-boat in torpedoes, and always were a threat. And again, they were countered by British surface ships, certainly, but also by the strike wings of the RAF Coastal Command. And finally, there was a problem with coastal convoys. The Germans got their iron ore from a port up in Norvik, which is, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but it's up here, and essentially went through coastal Norwegian waters, past the Kattegat and Skagerrak, and into the canal barge and river system in northern Germany. That was the route that they used all year long. In the summer and spring, they could use a route directly across the Baltic to get their iron ore. So this iron ore was other military material were carried by coastal convoys all the way down into Belgium, and of course there was coastal convoys working the coast of France. So that was definitely something that had to be interdicted, and also the enemy warships that were based along the coast of France and the Low Countries had to be destroyed when possible. The fourth mission was strategic attack of the German homeland, and this is the one that seems to get about 90% of the press and 90% of the even today some controversy, and whether or not it worked, and that's a controversy that continues, and I did not get into who was right and who was wrong. All I did in the book was list how it was done and the results, especially the results as seen by the Germans. For after all, the real effect of strategic attack is how you change your enemy's viewpoint. If your enemy feels like he's cannot defend and he cannot afford to lose what he's losing in strategic attack, that's a big step towards him wanting to seek peace. So strategic attack was actually by two methods. The first method was championed by the Royal Air Force. This was area bombing. It was essentially begun by the Brits after London was bombed. The Germans say accidentally. No one really knows for sure. But once the Germans bombed London, the Brits quickly retaliated, and after that it was do your worst on both sides. The principal target for area bombings in 1940s technology was cities, unfortunately, and cities are where people live. And so that's when the civilian casualties really started to mount. The Brits were really interested not only in destroying workers' houses, but they were also interested in destroying the war industries. Much of the German war industry pre-war was located within cities or the suburbs of cities, because that's again where their workers lived. Not everybody had a car to drive to work in the morning, so you had to put your war industries close enough that to your population centers that the workers could travel to work. The problem with area bombing, well, first of all, they did area bombing because they tried day bombing. That didn't work at all. Their bombers, even the Lancaster was probably the best bomber they had, was lightly armed for self-defense. Even towards the end of the area bombing campaign in 1945, they still were operating mainly with 30 caliber, essentially 30 caliber machine guns for self-defense, which could not defeat the armor on later German fighters. It was also very short-ranged, so it was not a very powerful defensive armament. Hence, you go into your target at night and you bomb. You navigate as best you can to your target, and you drop your bombs, and you hope to hit something important. So it was a tactic, it was a strategy that was forced upon them by the circumstances, the kinds of airplanes they operated, the kind of enemy they were fighting, the kind of targets they were trying to destroy, and the fact that daylight was strictly not a practical alternative. You need daylight to do any kind of really aimed bombing. And the Brits did some workarounds to this area, finding the target. They developed navigational aids, and they had so-called master bombers and pathfinders would go in and mark cities or factory areas, allowed to follow on aircraft to attack those. The trouble with that always was, first of all, the Germans quickly deployed fog generators around their key targets. The Ruhr, which was a key industrial area that they bombed, was perpetually smoggy, and there were electronic countermeasures that the Germans deployed. And of course, they also had flak, and they also had, after 1941, radar equipped night fighters. So it was a tough mission. They lost a lot of guys. They lost roughly 79 to 80,000 aircrew, killed, wounded, missing, and not too much different than the Americans did with daylight bombing. And the German response to that was this so-called Kammhuber line, which was in operation in 1942. You can see it's complete coverage of all the potential approaches into industrial Germany. The second method for strategic attack was done by the U.S. Army Air Force, and that was precision daylight bombing, a concept that had been developed in the mid-1930s. We actually bought an airplane to go with this, which was the B-17, and later on they also bought a little bit higher technology airplane, the B-24. The B-17 was a beautiful, stable bombing platform, heavily armed, and equipped with a bomb sight that, at least theoretically, allowed you to bomb targets very accurately. And the American Air Force targets were somewhat different. They were looking at specific production sites, places where airplanes were being built, or the components for airplanes, like ball bearings. We've all heard about ball bearing. And also looking at combat vehicles, trucks. The Germans were way behind, even in 1940, the United States, with the number of vehicles, especially trucks, available. And also, as the campaign evolved in the 1944, attacks against oil refineries, because the Germans needed synthetic oil refineries for most of their fuel supply, especially after they lost their major source of natural petroleum, which was down in Romania. Less famous about the strategic attack was continuous attacks against the transportation infrastructure, so that even if you could produce stuff, you couldn't get it to the end user. And finally, from late 1943 was a significant decimation of the Jagdwaffe. That's the German fighter force. And that was something that the Americans were able to do, not only because the B-17 was fairly heavily armed, but also because we developed escort fighters that could accompany the bombers all the way to their targets. So there's your B-17. Lots more guns. They're 50 caliber machine guns. The Russians had a very similar machine gun. I saw in Desert the results of use of that gun. A very, very devastating weapon against anything other than an armored vehicle. And even there, all the little accoutrements on the outside of the vehicle get pretty busted up. But these 50 caliber rounds would do a real good job on an aircraft engine, could penetrate fuel cells and that sort of thing. And they fired a mix of armored piercing and incendiary. Not a comfortable job for the guys that had to shoot the guns, but at least they could shoot back. The Germans countered that by attacking from the nose, and all these diagrams are in the book, by the way. So here's 2 seconds away. If you can see my pointer here, that's what a B-17 looks like. You're 15 seconds from hitting that plane nose to nose. 8 seconds later, or 7 seconds from collision, you're 1 mile away. Still can't shoot, out of range. At 4 seconds from impact, you're 3,000 feet away, and the bomber starts to shoot at you because his 50 caliber nose guns, if he's got them, longer range than your cannon on your Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf. And then at 1,800 feet is where you can open fire. That's at 2.5 seconds before impact. So if you're a fighter pilot, you're starting to pucker up a little bit here, and you have to break off at 750 feet to avoid hitting the empennage of the bomber or getting whacked by the tail or by the belly turret as you dive below. So you didn't have a lot of time to shoot. Guys who tried to attack from the tail found out that very soon after the bombing started, that the B-17 had at least two 50 caliber machine guns in the tail turret, and the guy's only job was to keep from being shot down. So he could concentrate on shooting your fighter, and he could shoot you at a further distance than you could shoot him. So let's talk about precision bombing just a second. There's been a lot of arguments about that. This is precision bombing. This is an aircraft plant, or used to be, in this perimeter. And the bomber, this is a bomber B-17. The name of it is Virgin's Delight. This was what they were hoping to achieve on every mission, was to hit the target. They weren't trying to hit these villages over here full of people. A lot of these people probably worked in this facility. They didn't even try to hit the runway where the completed aircraft were launched to the end user. They just wanted the plant, and that's what they bombed. This was the desired effect. And of course, one problem with this is you can see this target. Many times in Europe, very hard to see because you had bad weather or fog or an underlayer of clouds or smoke screen and all the other things that detracted from that. Now, one thing that detracted from precision bombing was intercepting fighters. So you didn't want to be worried about being shot by a fighter while you're trying to put bombs on target. So we started escorting actually very early on, we started escorting our bombers to give them some self-defense capability. The Brits tried this with the Spitfire, but the Spitfire, based in Britain, could only get as far as Paris. In fact, not even that far very well. So there was no air combat capability. And the Germans simply waited until the Spitfires turned back. So by 1943, we had deployed these bad boys. This is a P-47 Thunderbolt. It has 8 50 caliber machine guns in the wings. It will disassemble a Messerschmitt, fairly short order, in a very tough airplane to shoot down. The trouble with this airplane is this would only get you as far as the Belgian border of Germany. So therefore, your bombers, once they were in Germany, lost their escort, and that's when the interceptors really went to work on them. So the P-47, good air-to-air fighter, very heavy-duty air-to-air fighter, and what it did was drive the German twin-engine, what they call heavy fighters or destroyers, away from the bomber streams, because they could shoot these down almost at will. They had a little bit tougher time against German single engine fighters, but again, they were very competitive against them. This is the Schweinfurt. This is the first bombardment wing going to Schweinfurt in September 1943. These little ghost B-17s here are the ones that were shot down in the order they were shot down in. You can see that the first one that was shot down was in the 91st Bomb Group, tail end Charlie Guy. And you will notice that that as you got further back, you had less losses. The main losses were in the front of because the Germans were using this attack from the front tactic. Lost a bunch of airplanes out of this wing. This was the one that went to the Messerschmitt 4th Bombardment Wing. Went to the I'm sorry, I take that back. These guys went to Schweinfurt. The previous wing went to Regensburg. Regensburg was a big German Messerschmitt production facility for Me-109s, and they just about leveled the place. They were out of production for months. This wing, I think, went to Schweinfurt looking for ball bearings. Good tactic. Trouble was the Germans had bunches of spare ball bearings, even though these two attacks caused them to begin dispersing the aircraft industry and cut into their effectiveness. And then finally, by late 1943, we're starting to get these guys, P-51s. Initially, the P-51B and C, which was it was a Razorback type canopy, and then they got the bubble canopies, which were much better for air-to-air. And these were absolutely dominated the skies over Germany after March 1943, at least during the daytime. One thing the strategic attack did was went after the canals. And again, you don't hear much about that, but a lot of German material, especially think bulk stuff like coal, went not only by rail, but also by canal. The fifth mission, troop carry and cargo transport. Now, the United States had to build and deliver the airplanes to make this happen. We had a large airline industry. Already had the DC-3, which was the core of World War II cargo and troop carry capability. We had to also develop the cargo and airdrop technology because the DC-3s in the United States before the war were mainly carry passengers rather than cargo. And finally, you had to recruit and develop airborne forces, not only guys to fly the planes and crew them and to maintain them, but also obviously the infantry, mainly infantry guys, to learn how to jump out of airplanes, learn how to fly gliders that were towed by C-47, and so on and so forth. The Brits had a parallel program, also the RAF. They tended to use obsolescent bombers to tow their gliders, and they were a lot more into delivering troops and equipment by glider than they were by parachute, although they did do parachutists too. The C-47 could carry about 21 paratroopers, although in combat, the so-called stick of paratroopers was 18 guys, or roughly half a platoon. So when they weren't dropping paratroopers, they just couldn't sit there and read the paper. They had many other jobs, moving equipment. The C-47, incidentally, had one thing they changed from the DC-3 was they added a wider door to get things in and out. This is an aircraft engine being transported from a maintenance facility to a frontline unit. Not so much in Europe, but in India and China and Burma and so on, when they had to move trucks and bulldozers, they got at the welding charge and they cut them into pieces, loaded them on the airplane. When they got where they're going, they got out another welding torch and put them back together. So very versatile airplane here, and more than that, very versatile people. And if you want to know what makes an Air Force a victorious Air Force, it's the people. As much as the airplanes, probably more. And then finally, last but not least, is support of the land forces, including concept of operations. How are you going to support the land forces? They didn't have this in 1940 when the Germans invaded invaded the Low Countries and also France. And because of that, they really, really did not do a good job. They wasted a lot of airplanes, a lot of good people in the air and on the ground. And of course, the Germans drove the British Army off the continent. So back in 1941, 42, the Brits go back to the drawing board and they develop coordination techniques. The fighter command also had an air cooperation command, a sub-command, if you will, that developed these coordination techniques, developed a specialized communication so air could talk to ground and ground could talk to air, and ground commanders could talk to each other, talk to air commanders. And also, once you get all this done, you also have to train the troops and commanders to use the system that you developed. And when you got a guy who was born in 1897 running your army, that sometimes can be a problem. Now, this is one of the few pictures. I've got 3 books published now. This is I think one of the few pictures of generals I have in here. This guy. Nobody ever heard of him. This guy is Frederick Morgan. He's a British lieutenant general, combat veteran. This is the guy that planned the D-Day invasion. It wasn't Eisenhower. He just approved the things that Morgan planned and made suggestions. Sometimes not so much a suggestion as an order. But basically, the plan was Morgan's plan. And all the other generals, Montgomery and Bradley and Eisenhower, and just elaborated on the thought and the planning prowess of this guy, Frederick Morgan. And if you've never read anything about him, you need to. Frederick Morgan had an adversary, this guy, Erwin Rommel. And this is a conference in Paris sometime before D-Day. That's Rommel. That's Gert von Rundstedt. He is both of these guys are field marshals. He commands all the German forces in the West. And Rommel is his commands one of the army groups under Rundstedt, the army group that we had to run over when we got into Normandy, or run into rather. And this is General Blaskowitz. He commanded the German forces in the South. If you're wondering where I got this picture from, this was it was a German general, a one-star, I think, who ran around taking happy snaps. This is a happy snap. This didn't come out of a German propaganda deal. That's why Rommel's smiling. Doesn't have to look grim. And there's a box of these pictures at the Air Force Historical Research Agency called Karlsruhe Collection. So if you do look at my books, you'll see a lot of the pictures in my books come from that collection. It's just this one guy with little Leica camera taking pictures. And nobody told him he couldn't, so he did. There were other pictures being taken. One of the things about supporting the land forces is the knowing what the enemy defenses are going to be. This is a picture taken from a P-38 reconnaissance version, P-38. The guy's 100 feet off the ground, and these gentlemen that you see scurrying, these are German troops who are out there laying these anti-landing craft obstacles on the beaches. This P-38 is not a noisy airplane, and so he's flying along at 100 feet. They don't know he's coming till he's there. And of course, all they're hoping right now is that he's taking pictures and not strafing. So these are called dicing missions because it was named by the guys who flew them, because they were dicing with death, essentially. The good news was they were flying so low, they were actually the anti-aircraft crews up on the bluffs had to try to depress the barrels low enough to hit them. And you can see that they took some excellent pictures. And that was another way the land forces were supported by the air. This is my trusty P-47 here strafing a German airfield. This is gun camera film. This is a captured French bomber that the Germans were using. They had a bunch of these. They used them as fast transports. Supporting the army is very, very much a costly endeavor. Lost about 12,000 Allied airmen. isolating the German 7th Army in Normandy. And here, when you're down low on the deck and you're doing what you need to do, you're very vulnerable to German anti-aircraft fire, including light aircraft fire. This is a desired result of supporting the land forces in terms of cutting off the German army. This is a marshalling yard, or used to be. These are actually American troops. This picture was taken after the martial yard was overrun. There were problems with the marshalling yard campaign because the desired effect was to run your sticks of bombs through the marshalling yard, tear up the tracks, destroy the rolling stock. This is a bomb group's attack. These two squadrons, each line is a squadron of bombs. These two, right on target. These guys were not having a good day, and they hit off. This village here is full of French workers, so you don't want to hit these guys. And that was the problem, is that you had to have fairly good weather to do this and good bombing. So when you didn't, this happened. This is the same target a few seconds later. Another bomb group comes in. You can see the smoke from the first bombing. The second bombing hit the village. Why? Haven't been able to find out why, except it's either they misidentified the village as their target, or they simply did not aim correctly, or the winds kicked up. But you can see that the winds are blowing right to left, so I don't think it was a windage problem. So this is where Churchill and a lot of other leaders said, we got to be careful doing this because we have to live with these people after the war. De Gaulle, on the other hand, said, do what you got to do. But it was better when we had good weather and everything worked right. This is, I believe, the bridge at Mantes. It was blocked. This was a way to get from Germany into Normandy to the west of the Seine. And this is the bridge. There's an island here. I read in one history, I don't know if it's true or not, that Erwin Rommel had actually had a picnic here in this island the morning this bombing happened, and just going over that bridge, going about his field marshal business. But the thing I like about this is a French cathedral, and there was only very minor damage to the cathedral. Maybe a window or two might have been hit by flying concrete, but essentially this was not damaged, and all the civilian housing not damaged, which is why the American Air Force liked precision bombing. So that's the 6 air missions: defend the maritime routes, supply, defend Britain from the Luftwaffe, defeat the Kriegsmarine coastal forces, strategic attack on the German homeland, troop carry and cargo transport, support of the land forces. This is not a sequential list. This all happened in a coordinated manner. Each little piece was being done while other little pieces were being done in the other missions. The result was effectively that we crippled the Luftwaffe and we isolated and essentially crippled the German land forces. Now, if you get into the book and you like the narrative, suddenly I cut the narrative off just before D-Day. So the next book coming out that's just hitting the bookstores in early February will be Thunder over Normandy. And again, how Allied airmen helped liberate France from D-Day to Paris and beyond. So that concludes the presentation, and I'm going to turn it back over to Gregory.
Thank you, Joe. That was extremely thorough and has fantastic overview. There's already a few questions in the queue. Actually, there's also a number of raised hands. Mike, I'm going to go to you first. I know you have a time constraint. If you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Yeah. I wanted to know if you could go into a little bit more about what the effects of the, well, let's be specific, the daylight precision bombing campaign on industry in 1943, using as an example the ball bearings. what effect they had as of D-Day, as far as German production for D-Day and German operations around D-Day, um, and specifically also not just obviously they had long-term effects, but what the delay. In other words, if you had something like ball bearings, the first raid made them use up their reserves. The second raid, of course, then dug deeply into their production capacity, as well as having to decentralize. So how did that affect production as of D-Day, German production as of D-Day?
Well, the effect the effect of on production itself is the Germans were were very smart people. The major effect of Schweinfurt Regensburg, if you like me to zero in on that, because we're talking about 1943, of course, there was a variety of strategic bombing that went on, not only, that particular mission, but a lot of bombing that went on in France and the Low Countries. But as far as Schweinfurt Regensburg, it did several things. First of all, it made the Germans dig into their strategic surplus, or their strategic reserve, I should say, of ball bearings. And also they had to increase the import of ball bearings from other countries. So if it wasn't for the attacks, they would not have had to make that effort. And of course, war, D-Day or anything else, a war is a sum of the effects. And the sum is often more than just a component. So the fact that the factories were bombed, they were both put out of commission for, Schweinfurt was put out for several months. Regensburg was also put out for several months. It made the Germans begin to disperse their critical industries. So that actually had more effect than the actual loss of those particular buildings and the machine tools and things they lost. They didn't lose many workers because B-17s, not real fast airplane. They had the workers had adequate warning that this bombing was coming. They knew it was coming to them because the Germans had complete radar coverage of the country. And so the workers did not suffer a lot of casualties. They were in bomb shelters. But the big effect, at least as I've read it, and I've read the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, and I've read stuff by Speer, Albert Speer, who was Minister of Munitions, and also Willie Messerschmitt, who was, of course, one of the big airplane manufacturers. And what it was a Messerschmitt factory that was hit at Regensburg was this. Those attacks, and the fact that the Americans were willing to do those attacks in daytime and to hit those specific targets, told them that nothing in Germany was safe if it was concentrated, in a few places. So if you read things like Speer's books, Inside the Third Reich, and the second one he wrote Inside Spandau Prison, they had to look at all their industries, and they had to begin relocating large manufacturing centers out into the countryside and away from their original sites. So that's an indirect effect. Now, how does that affect D-Day? It affects D-Day because if you say, and I'm just pulling numbers out the air now, say that originally with the original traditional thing, if you didn't attack it, then they would have built 20,000 fighters before D-Day. Well, with the attacks, now they build 10,000 because they have to stop production at different places and move things around. So now they only got 10,000. So you've got, and again, these are not quote numbers. These are just, I'm making these up for the example. You've got half a number of fighters to deal with. The other thing that happened, effect on the Germans, was they started pulling big time fighters out of France and out off the Eastern Front and converting them into air defense units. the guys that went to air defense units in Germany were no longer were receiving air-to-ground training. So the Luftwaffe, famous for being at one time the best air-to-ground air force in the world, is now losing that edge because now they're having to put fighters into defense. So by D-Day, they have less fighters to deploy, and also because the Schweinfurt-Regenburg forced us to put the P-51 very quickly into Europe. The P-51s, once they get into Europe, are unleashed by the Air Force not only to escort fighters, bombers, but also to range over the German countryside. So by the spring of 1944, and you can read this in Adolf Galland's book, First and Last, and other sources, there's nowhere in Germany where you can operate airplanes, including training bases, where you're not safe, where you're safe from P-51s. And they're all over. And I read that time and again, if you read late war Luftwaffe literature, is they're being cramped. So basically, by the time D-Day happens, because of the lack of replacement trained pilots, reduction in production, but mainly the lack of those pilots. And now a third factor is we've switched from hitting ball bearings and aircraft production factor, and we've looked at the results. And now we're hitting oil, not only production of oil, but also delivery of oil to the frontline units. And those are being attacked by airplanes. So this all had factors in D-Day. As far as the Brits go, the fact that the Brits very early attacked the V2 research facility at Peenemünde, and also the Americans and Brits attacked the V1 sites along the coast. Those all had great effect on D-Day. Can you imagine that landing going on with V1s falling into the invasion roadstead where the landing craft were being loaded with troops and sent ashore? And the reason why they were able to hit those missile sites was because the Allies were seizing control, certainly already had air superiority over France, so they could hit the V1 sites. And as far as the Brits go, the Brits were hitting the V2 at night, where the less efficient night defenses were in operation. Did I go too far, Mike, or is that really what you were looking for?
Oh yeah, that's a good answer. I mean, I was under the impression that that also the delay in production, using up the reserves and the delay in production, actually delayed production of weaponry and trucks right across the board, and that's usually not dealt with. It certainly wasn't dealt with the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, and the effect of things like ball bearings and similar things like that on the production of actual machinery used to make, used in the factory. So in other words, to produce the machines, this is a more indirect effect, then affected the ability to produce. I just was wondering how much of it was affected by D-Day. But you've answered the question very well, so there's no reason for me to keep on going like this. Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Okay, Mike, and I guess Greg, if you want to put my email out, I've certainly got no problem with that.
Oh, okay.
And I'll be glad to talk with folks by email also.
Thanks, Joe. I will put your email in the chat. Alex, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, just well, one thing I've read on the ball bearings issue is that actually the Germans were able to shift production and actually import a lot of ball bearings from Sweden, and that helped them ameliorate the problems. But again, I want to mostly ask a more general question, which of course is that the post-war strategic bombing survey turned out to be kind of rather skeptical on the effectiveness of the bombing. So actually, I wonder in general, since I assume you probably read through that, what's your opinion on their assessment of how strategic bombing went, and, what you agree with and disagree with from that, very detailed study. Thank you.
Of the strategic bombing survey. I
Yeah.
think it's like most historical documents. It is definitely written from an American perspective, and there were, and it also included a bunch of economists who not necessarily agreed with the particular way that we went about attacking German industry. Getting back to the ball bearings, as I was talking with Mike just a minute ago, the effects were not so much that, oh my God, we don't have any more ball bearings, but that now they had to do things like, spend money to get them from Sweden and relocate. So, but the strategic bombing survey, there's good data in there, and there's some data that I would question based on what I've read from German sources. And although I'm not a fluent speaker, I took it in college and in high school, and when I was in Germany, I could order a beer pretty accurately. But I have not read a lot of their material in the original German, but the translations I read, Adolf Galland, I think, is outstanding, and so is Albert
Right.
Speer, and certainly where they were in positions to make comments. And they were not happy. The Germans, I will tell you this, the Germans were not happy that we were willing to spend 60 bombers to knock out those two facilities. And it's a sad statistic, but essentially we replaced the bombers that day in the United States. It's so the bombers were expendable. What's not expendable is the guys, of course, but we also had people in training that took their place. And remember, all volunteers. So it was an important attack. It certainly benefited us also in that we realized that we weren't going to do it without escort fighters. What really happened after that, in preparation for D-Day, was the attack on the oil industry. And you see that shortage of oil come through, and the ability to train, the German shortages of fuel, and also motor vehicles from the attacks, and so on and so forth. So does that answer your question, Alex?
Yeah, but I also wanted to ask about, the famous transportation plan, which is, of course, the pre-D-Day Allied air operations against, German lines of communications, and of course during the Normandy campaign, and what you think, how successful you think that was. Again, I think a lot of historians argue that that's, that our ability to delay its, but also inflict losses on the Germans, coming into Normandy is what basically won that for us. Thanks.
Well, the transportation plan in terms of cutting off transportation was spectacular. But I think this is from what I've read, and also talking to historians, some like Steve Ambrose, for example, is that the Germans essentially were isolated. The 7th Army in Normandy was isolated. It was isolated because we had dropped the bridges across the major rivers. Essentially, the Seine and the Loire River essentially drew a box around Normandy and Brittany, and the Germans had a lot of trouble getting supplies, equipment, and troops across those. Now, that doesn't mean it was the only thing that isolated them, because our deception plan convinced Hitler and company that the Pas de Calais was the ultimate target. Normandy was a diversion. So certainly part of the effect of isolating the German army was a deception plan. And airplanes had a factor in that too. We bombed for every bomb we dropped in Normandy area, we dropped 2 in the Pas de Calais area, again to support that deception. So certainly, though, the transportation plan was successful, but it was more successful, I think, and this is my opinion, it was much more successful because of dropping the bridges than it was in bombing the marshalling yards, and also resulted in much fewer French casualties than the marshalling yard bombing did.
And what's your assessment of, attrition of the German army? Is it, losses is that exaggerated, you think, as well? That, we really took out a lot of Panthers going into Normandy in some
Oh, we
historic.
did. Uh, in researching the book I'm in right now, which is kind of a recap kind of thing,
No.
we destroyed the German. Let me rephrase that. The Germans lost most of the tanks and armored fighting vehicles they put into Normandy, and that was not only the Seventh Army, but also Panzergruppe West. I believe there was also eventually established an army in Normandy, a Panzer Army. But most of those vehicles, if nothing else, ran out of gas.
Right.
They couldn't be operated in daytime because when they moved in daytime, they immediately got to meet a Typhoon or a P-47 and in a high velocity rocket, and that was the end of their war. So the Germans lost almost all the armor they put into Normandy, and the armor they had left, they had a hard time drawing across the Seine because of the bridges kept on being dropped. So again, that all had to do with the transportation campaign, and the transportation campaign regionally was the marshaling yards and the bridges, but locally, in a way, also included the interdiction of the lines of communication going into the front lines and between the German units. Germans could not move in the daytime at all. They were totally pinned down. But of course, we don't really talk too much about that in this book because this book is about the preparatory air battles.
Right.
Transportation plans in there, but when you talk about interdicting movement and the losses they had, you're going to see a lot more of that in the third book, where we're actually
Okay.
talking about the
I'll have to
invasion.
get that then. Yeah, thank you so much.
Surely. Nice talking to you, Alec.
Yep, thanks, Alex. Brandon, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
First, how does your background as an intelligence officer for an air wing, especially during major operations, what unique insights do you think you get from being in that position that someone who wasn't examining the same sort of turf would come up with? That would be my primary question. And just real simple question, why wasn't the P-38, why don't we hear more about it being a high-level escort with the B-17s in France and Germany than we do? Because it was used that way successfully in the Pacific. And finally, do you play any commercially available war games, and what do you think of them if you do? Thank you.
Okay. If it's okay for me. Let me start with the experience part of it. I started my career in fighter squadrons. I was a squadron intelligence officer. And that's, I got my education at a university. I got my training at an Air Force school. But I really got my expertise from my pilots, because one thing my pilots taught me was their requirements. And so very early I was, I'm a Cajun. I'm not real bright, but I'm bright enough to know when I'm talking to the people and know what they're talking about. So that in writing a book like this, I'm writing it as if I'm talking to my squadron. And later on in my career, I got to a headquarters. And in a headquarters, being an intelligence officer in a headquarters is a much more, how should I put it? It's a much more complex problem, because there you have a lot of customers. You have general officers who are trying to make decisions with skillfully and with knowledge. You have other career fields that they get a piece of your time too. And so when you write a book like this, I'm able to, I think, better parse out that this big air war is actually a bunch of individual missions, and each of those missions is a bunch of individual objectives, and each of those objectives eventually devolve down to individual guys who are sitting in cockpits or in bombardier seats or in air gunner seats, and they have to execute. And no one, and all, even the generals, have a complete picture or had a complete picture of this air war in Europe. It had to be distilled the higher you went. So when I write this, I have the advantage of having worked at all levels. So I kind of know that, for example, when I write about the supporting the land forces, I was an A-10 unit. Our guys before the war, way before the war, I had organized a trip. They went to a National Guard training facility. They were running a tank brigade through the facility, and the guys got to ride in tanks. So when they got to Desert Storm and they had to support American tanks, they knew with the guys in the tanks, their problems and what they needed. So the experience thing when writing books like this is that you've been there, not in the same war, not with this essentially the same, all the same challenges, but at least you have an idea of how little you really know until you do the research and you find people who write books and leave records that did know what was going on, and you try to put it all together, and then you put it in something that's readable by the general public. Okay, I've already lost the bubble in your other questions there. Could you give me another one?
One was about P-38, and the other one was about if you play or know about commercial war games, that you can buy in a store.
Okay, well, the P-38, I'll definitely tell you about war games, but getting to the escorts, first of all, the first thing we put into Britain or into Northern Europe was the P-30. We sent P-39s and P-40s to Europe, and they were obviously not going to be able to compete with high altitude fighters like the ME-109 or the BF-109 actually, but the BF-110. They just were not competitive at high altitude. So the P-38 came next. Incidentally, the P-39, we ended up giving a lot of those to the Russians. The Russians loved them, used them as low-level fighters, heavily armed, and they were certainly a match for the German ground support airplanes. The P-40s, the Brits liked them. They were a good airplane, but again, they're not high altitude. The reason why the P-39 and P-40 were not good high altitude airplanes is that they didn't have superchargers. So without superchargers, they were sent to other theaters where the air combat was mainly at medium to low altitude. So that takes care of the P-38, P-39, P-40. The P-38 had superchargers. It had Allison engines just like the other two airplanes, but had superchargers. So it could fly at high altitude. In fact, Howard Hughes, I believe, designed it as a high altitude interceptor. Trouble was, they got the engines and the superchargers pretty much right. It was a little bit of a maintenance nightmare, but they did it. But when it got into Northern Europe and they're up at 30,000 feet and it's 50 degrees below zero, they found out that the heaters didn't work so good. And the guys were freezing in the cockpits. There was icing inside the cockpit on the canopy. Lots of problems. So the P-38s were good, but they were not good in the operating environment again, just like the 39 and 40 that they needed to be. Now, later in the war, incidentally, one other thing. We put like 5 groups of P-38s into England in 1942, and then we almost immediately stole them and brought them down to North Africa because the range that they had was needed in North Africa. And in North Africa, they were fighting primarily at medium low altitude where those heating problems did not occur. If you look at a P-38, the pilot sits in a gondola between the two engines. He's separated from the two engines by the wing roots. And unfortunately, that second serendipitous heating you get in like a P-51 or a P-47 from the engine being on the other side of the firewall from your feet, you don't get in a P-38. So it's chilly. And a cold fighter pilot tends to be less efficient than a warm fighter pilot. They did very well down in the Med. I think this is in the book, I'm not sure, but the P-38 was faster than the German fighters, among other things. And there's a quote in the book, I think it's in this one, that four Messerschmitts are flying along one day, and they see some P-38s out ahead of them. So they sneak up behind them, and they fire, but they're out of range. But they fire a little early, and the P-38s notice that there's something not good happening. So they firewalled the P-38s and just drew away from the Me-109s. So here, Me-109s, who used to having a speed advantage, are suddenly just outrun. So the Americans didn't even turn to fight; they just put on the juice and just walked away from the Messerschmitts. Okay, war games. What war games do I like? I like War in the Pacific Admirals Edition because it's got a lot of logistics in it. Only trouble is they don't have really a European counterpart to that. At least one I think is good. I have War in the West. I've tried to get into it, but I find that the air tasking there, I just don't like the way it's done. I don't think it's hands-on enough for an air guy like me, because it's mainly, you preset, I'm going to do this much of this and this much of that. You don't really get to pick targets and things. Some of the other games I have a brand new game, which I'd recommend to y'all. And I hope I'm not getting Greg in trouble copyright wise or anything. But it's a game called Keep 'em Rolling, which is a game about the movement of the Allied troops from the Seine River to the Belgian border. And it's a logistics game. That's the main emphasis on it. Keep 'em rolling. And you can see it in Board Gamer type of reviews. That's keep M, with apostrophe EM, rolling. And it's really all about the logistics. And when you get right down to it, what the famous quote is, amateur study tactics, professional study logistics. Okay, another one I have is France 1940, and also Fortress Europa. And frankly, since I've been writing, I haven't had a chance to spread out my little cardboard squares as much as I'd like to. But after I finish this fourth book, I think I'm going to take a break and try to do that. So that would be the good ones. Combat Flight Simulator is good. It's a bit dated now. It's good, but honestly, that's really if you like that first person stuff, and I'm more interested right in this phase of my life, at least, in how the planning was done and executed. And those games I mentioned, a lot of planning, a lot of good execution.
Thank you.
Okay.
Great. We'll take two more.
Surely.
We'll take Kay and then close out with Gary. Kay, apologies. If you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Okay. Well, I have it's not about military tactics exactly, but I have a cousin I had a cousin who was who was a fighter pilot, was helping out the RAF very early on, even prior to when not D-Day, but Pearl Harbor, when the U.S. got into the war. Right. And the family legend is he was shot down over Belgium in May of 1940. And he's buried in Belgium. His name is listed in the British War Museum, and I'm actually kind of proud of that. But so that would be the Battle of France that you mentioned, and is that covered in your book?
No, the Battle of France is covered in my first book because it was contextual. I included a lot in the early war combat that was occurring while the Battle of Atlantic was starting and proceeding. I kind of felt it was necessary to talk about why it was necessary to fight the Battle of the Atlantic, which was because the Germans had, overrun Poland. They had overrun Scandinavia, or at least 2/3 of it. They'd taken Denmark and Norway, and then in the spring of 1940, they invaded. Pretty much simultaneously, they invaded Holland, Belgium, and France. The Brits, and if your cousin was, I believe it said your cousin was in the RAF. He was there in the along the French Belgian border. That's where the Brits were.
He's
They
an
were
American. He's an American who was helping the RAF. He was a fighter pilot, but he was an American.
right. He was right. Yes, ma'am. Understand.
Oh,
But he would have been, if he was RAF, he would have been flying over that part of Europe. The French did the French-German border, and the Brits were deployed along or across the intersection of the French and Belgian border. And if he was shot down in May of 40, and he was an American, he was an American pilot in our traditional RAF squadron. Some of the guys that went over to squadrons that were all Americans, the so-called Eagle squadrons, weren't in combat that early in the war. So he would have been in a regular RAF squadron, even as an American.
and you cover that in your book, right? Something about, or what's the name of
Yes,
your
ma'am.
book?
The first book is Six Air Forces Over the Atlantic.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
And yes, ma'am. And it's pretty. The campaigns are pretty delineated in there. I don't think there's any trouble finding the May 1940 German attack into the Low Countries. And thank your family for their contribution. The guys who were fighting in Britain and helped Britain stay alive. It would be a different world today if Britain had folded.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kay.
Yes, ma'am.
Gary, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question, Gary.
Yeah, hi. I'm glad you
Hi, Gary.
I'm glad you put out your email address because you'll probably be hearing from me. I've been working on a major paper that has a large overlap with some of the subjects you said, so I'd like to run it by you at some point. But I've spent a lot of time in German archives and specifically, and also British archives, but in the German archives there in Freiburg, I compiled the Luftwaffe at a high level. We used to put out a report every 10 days. So I put together all those statistics. And so I know you noticed you didn't really deal with, you just deal with the Western Air Forces. But just one interesting thing is if you look at the, just at the end of month strength reports for single engine fighters that were operational already,
Right.
and, just compare month over month. By far, the biggest decrease month over month was July 1943. Coming in a distant second was June of 1944, when there wasn't really much, when there was a lot of aerial combat over France, but not much over, not much in the way of strategic bombing. So I'm glad you did not fall into this, or maybe you do in the book, or maybe you have a different perspective. But I didn't hear you say. As a matter of fact, you did say you disavowed the idea that the Luftwaffe was destroyed. Just from a numeric standpoint, the number of fighters available at the end of May 1944 was basically not different than it had been if you take the average of 6 months, 12 months, it's pretty much always around 1,100. They were able to, even though they took a lot of losses, they were able to sustain their numbers. And now I can't really say very helpfully, the Luftwaffe started to compile in September of 43 monthly statistics over where their fighter losses were, by west, south, east, and over the homeland. But unfortunately, it didn't go back to July of 1943. But from a different source, I compiled a list of the 230 German Experten that had 60 or more victories or claims. And if you look at the losses, I put them in a database because that's what I do professionally. And if you look at the losses, by far the largest month is July of 1943, not the months leading up, not in 1944 and the months leading up to D-Day. but 11 were killed in July of 1943, of which 8 were on the Eastern Front. The second most month was 6, and that was the following month in August of 1943, and all of those were killed over the Eastern Front. So I do think that that's one part of the story that's really neglected. And you know we're the Western forces. You know, obviously there's always that sort of home team bias, but I think we one of the things that has not really been explored is just the number of losses that the Luftwaffe took over the Eastern Front. So that's my comment. I don't know if you have anything to say about that, and I look forward to communicating with you in the future.
Okay, well, I'd love to see your paper. Yeah, there's a huge amount of history that hasn't been captured yet, and more importantly, hasn't been published yet. And certainly, anybody that's out collecting data and getting into a form that's accessible is a good thing. As far as the number of fighters they had only a few hundred in France. And yes, the Eastern Front was very important for the Eastern Front was very important for not only the losses inflicted on the German Air Force, but of course the German Army too. We were kind of a mutually supporting, well, which we should be since we're allies. The Western allies were mutually supporting with our Soviet allies at the time. The Soviets were tying down the majority of the German army. The large amount of fighter pilots were out there in the eastern side in combat. The guys that racked up the expert, the guys that racked up the big scores. You find that a lot of those did it on the Eastern Front. The Soviet Air Force didn't really get its footing until 1943 because they had taken such large losses in the previous years. Also, Stalin was really an army guy and didn't believe that any strategic bomb was necessary because he didn't mind spending the manpower to walk his way into Germany and conquer it that way. So I will tell you that this is a statistic I've seen several places, that the Germans lost 1,000 fighter pilots between Christmas of 1943 and D-Day, in that they were short of pilots. More importantly, though, was they were not producing more pilots. As far as airplanes go, they always had a surplus of airplanes, but airframes are not as important as pilots and also fuel. And even before D-Day, their fuel supply was being destroyed, so they weren't able to train replacements like they used to. So I agree with everything you said in terms of the importance of the Eastern Front. Trouble is, when you've got 350 pages or so to talk about a topic, you have to put some limits on it. I haven't addressed the Eastern Front very much at all up until this fourth book I'm working on now. I do have a chapter called Feeding the Bear. We talk about the Arctic convoys, things like that. And also towards the end, and also talk about Operation Bagration, which was the big attack in 1943-4 that was coordinated with D-Day that crushed the Army Group Center, the Germans' Army Group Center, essentially toward the middle out of the German line in Russia. That attack was more successful because the Germans were involved with fighting us in the West. So it's the real two-front war that the Germans were warned time and again by their theorists that they should not fight. And they were tied down in the East and West. They could no longer use the West to rest and recuperate. And the East, of course, they never could. So anyway, but the pilot losses were the critical thing. The second thing was the oil campaign. The oil campaign started in May. So as we get closer, the fourth book, where we get closer to the end of the war, and the front lines get closer and closer together, I will have in the narrative in that fourth book more about what's going on in the East. But I appreciate the comment. Looking forward to talking with you by email.
Great, thanks.
Thank you, Gary. And I think
Okay, thank you. Have a good one.
Joe, I think that's a great place to end it. Thank you very much for a great lecture and Q&A. Again, the book is Air Battles Before D-Day, How Allied Airmen Crippled the Luftwaffe and German Armies in France. This is the second of the sequence. Sounds like at least 2 more are ready to go. Please join us in 2 weeks, Saturday, February 7th at 1 p.m. when historian Doug Most will discuss his book, Launching Liberty, the Epic Race to Build the Ships That Took America to War, which tells the overlooked story of one of World War II's monumental achievements, the building of America's fleet of Liberty ships. Hopefully you can join us then. Until then, definitely stay warm, stay safe. Joe, thank you so much for your time. And as I mentioned, this should be up on our social media channel probably within a few hours. Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.